The desert sun beat down on Sarah's face, baking the cracked earth of the wolf pen into something akin to a kiln. Dust devils danced on the horizon, mirroring the swirling chaos in her heart. Just days ago, she had been a schoolteacher in a small town, dreaming of a quiet life. Now she was caged like an animal, the prisoner of Jebediah, a rancher whose eyes held a darkness that swallowed stars. The pen was vast, a circle of rough-hewn logs sunk deep into the parched ground. The stench of wolf musk and something feral hung heavy in the air. 3 wolves, their coats the color of dust and shadow, paced restlessly. Their yellow eyes, cold and assessing, followed her every move. Fear, sharp and immediate, coiled in her stomach. She was no longer Sarah, the schoolteacher. She was prey. Jebediah hadn't spoken much, only muttered about her pretty face and how she would learn to appreciate his generosity. He'd thrown her a chunk of raw meat each day, the same fare as the wolves. The first day she hadn't touched it, stomach churning with disgust and terror. But hunger gnawed, and by the second day she found herself tearing into the bloody offering, her fingers slick with gore. The nights were the worst. The desert cold seeped into her bones, and the howls of the wolves echoed her own silent screams. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares filled with Jebediah's twisted smile and the snapping jaws of the beasts. She huddled in the meager shade of a gnarled mesquite tree that grew within the pen, its branches offering little respite from the sun's relentless glare. Her skin, once fair, was already burning, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. Hope, a fragile bird, fluttered weakly in her chest, threatening to die. She closed her eyes, remembering her mother's lullabies, soft melodies meant to soothe a child's fears. On a whim, she began to hum, the sound barely audible above the wind's mournful sigh. The wolves paused, their heads cocked, their ears twitching. She continued, her voice growing stronger, weaving a tapestry of sound that spoke of gentle meadows and starry nights. The wolves settled, their bodies relaxing, the tension easing from their powerful frames. A flicker of something akin to curiosity, perhaps even calm, shone in their yellow eyes. A tiny seed of hope began to sprout in the barren landscape of her despair. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, the sun felt like a brand on her skin. Sarah's throat was raw, but she hummed again, a little louder this time. The wolves stirred, their ears perked, but they didn't snarl or snap. Encouraged, she sang a full song, a simple ballad about a lost love and a hopeful reunion. As the last note faded into the desert air, the largest of the wolves, a scarred male with eyes like molten gold, took a step closer. He lowered his head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. A strange sense of connection washed over Sarah, a feeling she couldn't explain. These were wild animals, predators, yet they seemed receptive. She spent the rest of the day singing, her repertoire ranging from childhood rhymes to mournful hymns. Each song seemed to deepen the bond between her and the wolves. They began to anticipate her melodies, gathering closer to the mesquite tree when she started to hum. One evening, as the sky bled into shades of orange and purple, Jebediah came to the pen. He carried a bucket of water and a fresh piece of meat. His eyes, usually cold and distant, held a flicker of something unsettling. He tossed the meat into the pen, then stared at Sarah, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "You're getting soft on 'em, ain't ya?" he rasped, his voice like gravel. "They ain't pets, girl, they're killers." Sarah didn't respond, her heart pounding in her chest. She met his gaze, refusing to show fear. Jebediah chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't get any ideas," he warned. "This here's your new home, you belong to me now." He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with the wolves and the growing dread in her heart. As darkness fell, the wolves gathered around her, their presence a strange comfort. She sang to them, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She sang of freedom, of hope, of a life beyond the confines of the wolf pen. As she sang, she noticed something different about the wolves. They seemed more alert, more protective. The scarred male nudged her hand with his nose, a gesture that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a connection, a silent promise. They were listening, they understood, and maybe, just maybe, they were on her side. The fragile bird of hope fluttered again, a little stronger this time. She knew deep in her heart that she couldn't give up. She had to find a way to escape, not just for herself, but for the wolves too. They were all prisoners in Jebediah's twisted game, and she refused to let him win. The wolves themselves were a study in contrasts. The scarred male whom Sarah had started calling Shadow was the clear leader. He was larger than the others, his fur a mix of gray and black, his eyes holding a wisdom that belied his wild nature. The second wolf was a female, sleek and agile, with a coat the color of desert sand. Sarah named her Dust for her ability to blend seamlessly into the landscape. Dust was wary, always watchful, but she seemed particularly drawn to Sarah's singing, often sitting closest to the mesquite tree, her head tilted as if trying to decipher the meaning of the words. The third wolf was younger, smaller, and more skittish. He had a patch of white fur on his chest, like a star in the night sky, so Sarah called him Star. Star was easily startled, often bolting at the slightest sound, but he was also the most playful, sometimes chasing dust devils or batting at falling leaves. They were a pack bound by instinct and loyalty. Sarah had initially seen them as a threat, but now she recognized their individual personalities, their strengths and weaknesses. She had become an observer, a silent participant in their world. She learned their language, the subtle shifts in posture, the soft growls and whines that conveyed their moods. She understood when they were hungry, when they were restless, when they were simply content to bask in the sun. The connection between Sarah and the wolves grew stronger each day. They brought her small gifts, a feather, a smooth stone, a piece of bone. She, in turn, shared her meager rations with them, tearing off small pieces of meat and offering them to the pack. It was a fragile truce, a delicate balance between predator and prey, but it was real. One afternoon, a rattlesnake slithered into the pen. The wolves immediately tensed, their hackles raised, their teeth bared. Sarah, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as the wolves circled the snake, preparing to strike. But then she started to sing. A slow, mournful melody, a song of peace and harmony. The wolves paused, their aggression momentarily suspended. The snake, sensing the change in atmosphere, slowly retreated, slithering back out of the pen through a gap in the logs. Sarah realized then that her singing wasn't just a calming influence. It was a shield, a force that could ward off danger, that could protect her and the wolves from the harsh realities of their world. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was something more. She was a guardian, a protector, a voice of peace in a world of violence. And she would use her voice to fight for her freedom, for the freedom of the wolves, and for the chance to build a new life, a life where kindness and compassion could triumph over cruelty and despair. Miles away in a dusty saloon in the town of Redemption, Hank nursed a whiskey, the amber liquid reflecting the flickering lamplight in his weary eyes. He was a man etched with hardship, his face weathered like old leather, his gaze holding the distant sorrow of a lost love. A silver harmonica, his constant companion, rested in his calloused hand. Music was his solace, his escape from the ghosts that haunted his past. He overheard snippets of conversation, whispers about Jebediah, the rancher who ruled his land with an iron fist. Tales of cruelty, of stolen land, and of a woman held captive, caged with wolves. Most dismissed it as drunken ramblings, but something in Hank's gut twisted. He had seen too much injustice in his life, too much suffering go unanswered. The wolf woman, they called her. The image conjured in his mind was not one of a savage beast, but of a fragile creature, trapped and desperate. He knew what it was like to be caged, to have your spirit broken. He had lost his wife to illness years ago, and the grief had nearly consumed him. He understood the darkness that could take hold of a man, the despair that could drive him to madness. He finished his whiskey, the taste bitter on his tongue. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about justice, although that was a part of it. It was about redemption, about finding a way to heal the wounds of his past by helping someone else escape their own personal hell. He stepped out of the saloon, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the smoky interior. He saddled his horse, a sturdy Mustang named Blue, and pointed him towards Jebediah's ranch. The journey would be long and dangerous, but Hank was prepared to face whatever lay ahead. He had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. A flicker of hope, long dormant, began to stir within him. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. Maybe he could save the wolf woman. And maybe in saving her he could finally save himself. He pulled out his harmonica, the silver glinting in the moonlight, and began to play a mournful tune, a song of sorrow and longing, a promise of hope and freedom. The music echoed across the desert, carried on the wind, a beacon in the darkness. Hank arrived at Jebediah's ranch under the guise of a drifter looking for work. He traded his clean shirt for a patched-up one he'd carried in his saddlebags, smeared dirt on his face, and adopted a slouch that hid the strength in his shoulders. Jebediah, a hulking figure with eyes that seemed to bore right through a man, eyed him suspiciously but short on hands, grudgingly offered him a job mucking out stables. For days, Hank toiled under the scorching sun, performing menial tasks while subtly observing the layout of the ranch and the movements of its inhabitants. He kept his distance, avoiding unnecessary conversations and maintaining the facade of a simple, unassuming farmhand. But his gaze always drifted towards the wolf pen. From afar he saw her. The woman, pale and fragile, she moved with a quiet grace, even within the confines of her prison. He saw the wolves, their eyes fixed on her, their bodies relaxed. He witnessed her singing, the melodies carrying on the wind a haunting symphony of sorrow and hope. The other ranch hands scoffed, calling her crazy, but Hank saw the connection, the bond between her and the beasts. One evening, under the cloak of darkness, Hank crept closer to the pen. He hid behind a stack of hay bales, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as Sarah sang to the wolves, her voice soft and clear, weaving a spell of tranquility in the desolate landscape. He saw the wolves respond, nudging her hand, their eyes filled with a strange understanding. The rumors were true. She wasn't just a prisoner, she was something more. A whisperer, a caretaker, a beacon of light in Jebediah's dark world. Hank's resolve hardened. He knew he couldn't stand by and watch her suffer. He had to act, and he had to act soon. He returned to his meager cot in the bunkhouse, the image of Sarah and the wolves seared into his mind. He pulled out his harmonica, the silver cool against his skin, and began to play. A low, mournful tune, a song of freedom and hope, a promise that help was on its way. He played until the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, his music a silent prayer for Sarah's safety and a battle cry for the justice he was determined to deliver. He knew the risks were great, but the reward, the chance to free Sarah and perhaps, finally, free himself, was worth any price. He would find a way. He had to. The next day, Hank found an opportunity. He was assigned to mend fences near the wolf pen. Keeping his head down, he hammered and spliced wire, all the while calculating the distance, the angles, the best approach. When the other ranch hands took their midday break, Hank seized his chance. He moved to a spot just outside the pen, concealed by a thicket of scrub brush. He took a deep breath, pulled out his harmonica, and began to play. The tune was haunting, a melody filled with longing and sorrow, but also with a subtle undercurrent of hope. It was a song he had composed himself, a reflection of his own troubled past and his yearning for a better future. At first, nothing happened. The wolves continued to pace restlessly, their yellow eyes scanning the horizon. But as the music swelled, something shifted. Shadow, the scarred male, stopped pacing and turned his head towards the sound. Dust and Star followed suit, their ears twitching, their bodies tensing. Hank continued to play, his fingers dancing over the harmonica's reeds. He noticed the wolves' posture softening, their aggression fading. Shadow lowered his head slightly, his eyes half closed, as if listening intently. Dust sat down, her tail thumping softly against the ground. Even Star, the skittish one, seemed to relax, his body no longer trembling. The music had a profound effect on them. They were no longer savage beasts, but creatures soothed by the power of the melody. Hank experimented, changing the tempo, the pitch, the rhythm. He discovered that certain notes calmed them, while others seemed to energize them. He was learning their language, their musical preferences. He played for nearly an hour until the other ranch hands returned from their break. He quickly hid the harmonica and resumed his fence mending, his heart pounding with excitement. He had found his key. The harmonica was his weapon, his tool, his connection to the wolves. That evening, as he lay on his cot, he thought of Sarah. He imagined her hearing the music, feeling the hope that it conveyed. He knew he had to reach her, to let her know that he was there, that he was working on a plan to get her out. He pulled out his harmonica again and played a soft, lullaby-like tune, a message of comfort and reassurance carried on the night wind. He hoped she could hear it. He hoped she understood. He hoped she knew that she wasn't alone. The next day, Hank made his move. He was again assigned to fence duty near the wolf pen. As soon as the other ranch hands were out of sight, he started playing his harmonica, the same haunting tune he had played the day before. He watched as the wolves responded, their bodies relaxing, their eyes softening. Then he looked towards Sarah. She was standing near the mesquite tree, her eyes wide with surprise. He stopped playing and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded back. It was a silent acknowledgement, a confirmation that she had heard his music, that she understood. He started playing again, a little louder this time. As he played, he slowly moved closer to the fence, making sure to keep the wolves calm. He stopped a few feet from the pen, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Can you hear me?" he mouthed, his voice barely audible above the wind. Sarah strained her ears, her eyes searching his. "Yes," she whispered back, her voice hoarse. "I'm here to help you," he mouthed again. "I'm going to get you out of here." A flicker of hope ignited in Sarah's eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name is Hank," he mouthed. "I heard about you, about Jebediah." He paused, then pointed to the wolves. "Can you control them?" Sarah nodded. "With my singing," she whispered, "they listen to me." "I can control them with my music," Hank mouthed. "We can work together." They continued to communicate in this way, using simple words and gestures, sharing information, building a fragile trust. Hank learned about Sarah's past, about her life as a schoolteacher, about her kidnapping. Sarah learned about Hank's past, about his lost love, about his desire for redemption. As they spoke, the wolves remained calm, their eyes fixed on Hank, their bodies relaxed. They seemed to sense that he was not a threat, that he was there to help. Before the other ranch hands returned, Hank stopped playing and resumed his fence mending. He gave Sarah one last nod, a promise of hope and freedom. That night, as he lay on his cot, he knew that the plan was coming together. He had found an ally in Sarah, a partner in his quest for justice. Together they could outsmart Jebediah, they could escape the ranch, they could build a new life. But they had to be careful. Jebediah was a dangerous man, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood in his way. He pulled out his harmonica and played a soft, reassuring tune, a song of hope and courage. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had a reason to fight now. He had someone to save, and he wouldn't let her down. Over the next few days, Hank and Sarah finalized their plan. It was risky, but it was their only chance. Hank had managed to scout the stables and identify a relatively docile pony, a small, brown mare that the ranch hands called Cricket. He would sneak into the stables the night of the escape and saddle Cricket, leaving her near the wolf pen. The plan hinged on their ability to control the wolves. Hank would play a specific, frenzied tune on his harmonica, a melody designed to agitate and distract the wolves, creating a diversion that would draw the ranch hands away from the pen. At the same time, Sarah would sing a calming song, preventing the wolves from becoming completely uncontrollable. While the ranch hands were dealing with the wolf commotion, Hank would slip into the pen, cut a hole in the fence, and lead Sarah to Cricket. They would then ride away, heading towards the mountains, hoping to find refuge in the rugged terrain. The night of the escape was dark and moonless. A sense of anticipation hung heavy in the air. Hank, his heart pounding in his chest, crept towards the stables, his harmonica clutched tightly in his hand. He moved silently, avoiding the watchful eyes of the ranch hands, his every step measured and deliberate. He reached the stables undetected. He quickly saddled Cricket, leading her out into the darkness. He tied her to a nearby tree, making sure she was easily accessible. Then he took a deep breath and headed towards the wolf pen. He could see Sarah standing near the mesquite tree, her pale face illuminated by the faint starlight. She looked frightened but determined. He gave her a nod, a silent signal that it was time. He moved to a spot just outside the pen, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music was jarring, chaotic, a stark contrast to the soothing melodies he had played before. The wolves immediately reacted, their bodies tensing, their eyes flashing with primal energy. They began to howl, a deafening chorus that echoed across the ranch. As the wolves' frenzy escalated, Hank saw the ranch hands emerge from the bunkhouse, their faces etched with confusion and alarm. They grabbed their rifles and rushed towards the wolf pen, their attention focused on the chaos unfolding before them. This was it, their chance. Hank took a deep breath, pulled out his knife, and slipped into the shadows. He was ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. He had a plan, he had an ally, and he had a burning desire to see Sarah free. He wouldn't let anything stand in his way. Slipping through the shadows, Hank reached the wolf pen. Sarah was already near the fence, her eyes fixed on him, her face pale but resolute. The wolves were in a frenzy, their howls deafening, their bodies pacing restlessly. But as Sarah began to sing, her voice clear and strong despite the chaos, they seemed to regain a measure of control. Hank quickly cut through the fence, creating an opening just large enough for Sarah to slip through. He reached out his hand and she took it, her fingers trembling. Together they moved towards Cricket, the pony standing patiently in the darkness. As Sarah mounted the pony, Hank heard a shout. "What in tarnation is going on here?" Jebediah emerged from the darkness, his face contorted with rage, a rifle clutched in his hands. The other ranch hands, realizing what was happening, began to converge on their location. "Get on the pony," Hank yelled, pushing Sarah forward. "Ride." Sarah kicked Cricket into a gallop, the pony bolting forward, heading towards the open range. Hank turned to face Jebediah, his heart pounding in his chest. "You ain't going nowhere, boy," Jebediah roared, raising his rifle. Hank knew he couldn't fight him head-on. He needed to create a distraction to buy Sarah some time. He raised his harmonica to his lips and began to play, a high-pitched, piercing note that seemed to slice through the air. The wolves, hearing the music, responded immediately. They turned their attention towards Jebediah, their eyes flashing with primal fury. They began to advance, their growls low and menacing. Jebediah, momentarily distracted, lowered his rifle. "Get back, you mangy mutts," he yelled, but the wolves didn't obey. Hank used the distraction to his advantage. He lunged forward, tackling Jebediah to the ground. The two men wrestled, their bodies rolling in the dirt. Jebediah was stronger, but Hank was quicker. He managed to disarm Jebediah, throwing the rifle into the darkness. "You're making a mistake, boy," Jebediah spat, his face red with anger. "Oh, she's mine." "She's no one's," Hank retorted, punching Jebediah in the jaw. Jebediah staggered back, momentarily stunned. Hank used the opportunity to escape. He turned and ran towards Cricket, jumping onto the pony behind Sarah. "Let's go," he yelled, urging Cricket forward. They rode away, leaving Jebediah and his ranch hands behind. But Hank knew they wouldn't give up easily. They would be coming after them. The escape had been successful, but the fight was far from over. Cricket, though small, was surprisingly fast. She galloped across the open range, her hooves pounding against the dry earth. Hank looked back, seeing Jebediah and his men emerge from the ranch, mounting their horses and giving chase. The pursuit had begun. "Hold on tight," Hank yelled, urging Cricket to go faster. They rode for what seemed like hours, the wind whipping through their hair, the darkness closing in around them. Hank knew they couldn't outrun Jebediah forever. They needed to find a way to slow him down to create a diversion. Suddenly, they heard the sound of howling. The wolves, they were following them. Hank pulled out his harmonica and began to play, a low, mournful tune that he knew would resonate with the wolves. He played it loud and clear, his music a beacon in the darkness. The wolves responded immediately. They emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the starlight. They began to harass Jebediah and his men, nipping at their horses' heels, distracting them, slowing them down. "Get those wolves away from us," Jebediah roared, firing his rifle into the air. But the wolves were relentless. They were loyal to Sarah and they were influenced by Hank's music. They were determined to protect them. "Sing to them," Hank yelled to Sarah. "Help me control them." Sarah nodded and began to sing, her voice clear and strong, weaving a spell of peace and harmony. Her singing calmed the wolves, preventing them from becoming too aggressive, allowing them to harass Jebediah's men without causing serious harm. The wolves' assistance proved invaluable. They slowed Jebediah and his men down considerably, giving Hank and Sarah a much-needed head start. But Hank knew it wouldn't last forever. Jebediah was a determined man, and he wouldn't give up easily. As they rode, Sarah leaned closer to Hank, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "We're not out of the woods yet," Hank replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "But we will be, I promise you." He pulled out his harmonica again and began to play, a song of hope and courage, a promise of a better future. He played for Sarah, he played for the wolves, and he played for himself. He knew that together they could overcome any obstacle, they could escape Jebediah's grasp, and they could build a new life, a life filled with freedom and love. The wolves continued to provide cover, their howls echoing through the night, a testament to their loyalty and their untamed spirit. They were more than just animals. They were allies, protectors, and friends. And they would help Hank and Sarah fight for their freedom until the very end. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Jebediah and his men were nowhere in sight. They had managed to lose them, at least for now. Exhausted, they stopped Cricket near a small stream, allowing the pony to drink and rest. The wolves, their mission accomplished, settled nearby, their eyes watchful. The fear that had gripped them for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of exhilaration and newfound freedom. They had escaped Jebediah's grasp, and they were alive. As they sat by the stream, sharing a meager piece of dried meat, they began to talk, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, and their dreams. Sarah spoke of her life as a schoolteacher, her love of books, and her desire to make a difference in the world. She told Hank about her kidnapping, the fear and despair she had felt in the wolf pen, and the unexpected connection she had formed with the wolves. Hank, in turn, spoke of his lost love, the pain and grief that had haunted him for so long. He told Sarah about his life as a wanderer, his search for redemption, and his determination to help those in need. As they shared their stories, a bond began to form between them, a connection forged in shared trauma and newfound hope. They saw in each other a kindred spirit, someone who understood their pain, someone who shared their dreams. The moonlight bathed the landscape in a silvery glow, highlighting the beauty of the desert, the rugged mountains, and the untamed spirit of the wolves. As they sat together, their shoulders touching, they couldn't help but feel a growing attraction, a spark of desire that ignited in their hearts. Hank looked at Sarah, her pale face now flushed with color, her eyes shining with newfound hope. He saw in her a strength and resilience that belied her fragile appearance. He realized that he was falling in love with her. Sarah looked at Hank, his weathered face softened by the moonlight, his eyes filled with compassion and determination. She saw in him a protector, a friend, and a kindred spirit. She realized that she was falling in love with him too. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. They still had to escape Jebediah, they still had to find a safe place to live, and they still had to build a new life. But they were no longer alone. They had each other, they had the wolves, and they had a burning desire to make their dreams come true. And as they looked into each other's eyes, they knew that together they could overcome any obstacle, they could conquer any fear, and they could build a future filled with love and happiness. Their shared courage was blossoming into an untamed passion, a love as wild and free as the wolves that roamed the desert. Their respite was short-lived. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the landscape, they spotted riders in the distance. Jebediah and his men, they had found them. There was no escape this time. They were cornered in a narrow canyon, the towering rock walls offering no way out. They dismounted Cricket, preparing to face their pursuers. The wolves, sensing the danger, positioned themselves protectively around Sarah and Hank, their growls low and menacing. Jebediah rode forward, his face contorted with rage, his rifle raised. "It's over, Hank," he yelled. "There's nowhere left to run." "It's not over until I say it is," Hank replied, his voice firm. He pulled out his harmonica, ready to fight. "Sing to them, Sarah," he yelled. "We need their help." Sarah nodded and began to sing, her voice strong and clear, filling the canyon with a melody of courage and defiance. The wolves responded immediately, their eyes flashing with primal fury. Jebediah and his men charged forward, firing their rifles. Bullets whizzed through the air, kicking up dust and rock. Hank played his harmonica, the frenzied notes agitating the wolves, sending them into a controlled frenzy. The wolves attacked, leaping at the horses, biting at their legs, distracting the riders. Jebediah's men struggled to control their mounts, their shots going wild. Hank and Sarah fought side by side, their courage fueled by their love for each other and their determination to be free. Hank used his harmonica as a weapon, playing jarring notes that disoriented the riders, giving Sarah an opportunity to strike. Sarah, no longer the fragile schoolteacher, fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. She used rocks and sticks, anything she could find, to defend herself and Hank. The battle raged on, the canyon echoing with the sounds of gunfire, howling wolves, and the haunting notes of Hank's harmonica. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the tide began to turn. One by one, Jebediah's men fell, either wounded or dismounted. Jebediah, realizing he was losing, turned his attention to Sarah, aiming his rifle at her. "No," Hank yelled, throwing himself in front of Sarah, shielding her from the bullet. But the bullet never came. Shadow, the scarred male wolf, leaped in front of Jebediah, knocking him off his horse. Jebediah landed hard on the ground, his rifle flying from his grasp. The wolves surrounded Jebediah, their teeth bared, their growls menacing. Jebediah, realizing his reign of terror was over, surrendered. Hank, relieved that Sarah was safe, approached Jebediah, his eyes filled with anger and disgust. "It's over, Jebediah," he said. "Your reign of terror is over." He turned to the remaining ranch hands who were standing by, their faces etched with fear and resignation. "Get out of here," Hank said. "Leave this place and never come back." The ranch hands quickly mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Jebediah alone and defeated. The final showdown was over. Jebediah's reign of terror had ended. And Sarah and Hank were finally free. With Jebediah defeated and his reign of terror ended, a sense of peace settled over the canyon. The sun rose higher, casting a warm glow on the scene. Hank and Sarah looked at each other, their eyes filled with love and gratitude. They had survived, they were free. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. Hank smiled. "We start a new life," he said, "together." He knew they couldn't stay in the canyon. Jebediah's influence was far-reaching, and there were bound to be others who would seek revenge. They needed to find a new place to call home, a place where they could be safe and free. They decided to head west, towards the setting sun, towards the promise of a new beginning. They gathered their meager belongings, saddled Cricket, and prepared to leave. As they rode out of the canyon, they noticed something remarkable. The wolves were following them, Shadow, Dust, and Star. They were loyal to Sarah, and they seemed to have accepted Hank as one of their own. "They're coming with us," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. Hank smiled. "Looks like we have a family now," he said. They rode towards the horizon, the wolves trotting alongside them, their presence a constant reminder of the bond they had formed, the courage they had shown, and the love they had found. As they rode, Hank pulled out his harmonica and began to play, a joyful tune, a celebration of their newfound freedom. Sarah sang along, her voice blending harmoniously with Hank's music, creating a symphony of hope and love. Their shared courage had blossomed into a deep and untamed passion, a love as wild and free as the wolves that followed them. They were ready to face whatever the future held together. They rode off into the sunrise, their hearts filled with hope, their spirits soaring with freedom. They were Sarah, the schoolteacher who had found her voice in a wolf pen, and Hank, the lone cowboy who had found redemption in saving her life. They were a couple bound by shared trauma, newfound love, and the unwavering loyalty of a pack of wolves. They were a symbol of hope in a harsh and unforgiving world. And as they rode towards the horizon, they knew that their new life would be filled with adventure, love, and happiness. Well, the end.